Hi, welcome to the pre-party for December 4th, 2019. This is our second to last pre-party, which is kind of a bummer because I've really enjoyed this semester and I hope you have too, but this also means we can all go on to other things in the next couple of weeks and use everything we've learned this semester to really help enhance our lives as related to food. So today we are going to keep in mind that we're still in the milk and dairy section of the class, but I'm going to incorporate what we call sensory evaluation. So we're going to likely evaluate some dairy products and do some assessment of what actually they are and how we as humans perceive them. The first question that should come up to you is, what is sensory evaluation? If we have a specific definition, we can call it the human analysis of the taste, smell, sound, feel, and appearance of the food. So it's essentially us evaluating a food for different characteristics in the hopes of saying we like it, hopefully not in the hopes that we say we don't like it, or in the hopes of comparing it to other food products. In layman's terms, very simplest, we can say, do you really like the food? And that is an assessment or a sensory evaluation. We do have influences, though, that we have to consider for why people like certain foods and why other people don't like certain foods. So the first would be a physical influence. Our taste buds on our tongue are physical receptors, meaning the food that we eat has molecules that will attach to those taste buds. Some people have been shown to have many, many thousands of taste buds on their tongues. These people are called super tasters. There are other people, though, that are found to have maybe only 50 to 100 taste buds on their tongue, so they would be called non-tasters. So they are not able to discriminate different flavors based on what they're putting in their mouth and how that molecule of taste is interacting with their taste buds. The next influence on likes and dislikes is the psychological. Psychological influences are those that we start to develop in our brain or our conscious. Usually this results from a bad experience with food. For example, we brought up beets in Monday's lecture, and I told you I have rid beets from my diet since I was about 6 years old. And there's a story behind that because I decided one day at daycare I wasn't going to eat the beets, and I had to eat all my food on my plate in order to go to the playground. And so the best alternative was to put the beets in my milk, and that was how it was going to be done, and I can go play. Well, my teachers informed me that I had to drink the milk with the beets in it in order for me to go outside, and that really just hindered my perception of beets. Since then, I have not eaten a beet. Yes, it might be time to try something new, but this is an instance where our psyche, our conscious, tells us to like or dislike a certain food. The same goes if you really like a food. Say for me, it's coconut cream pie. I had a really great experience with coconut cream pie, and that causes me to say I like that type of pie. The next influence on our likes or dislikes are cultural. So as we know, we have many different cultures represented in the United States, and then as we go internationally, that cultural boundary really disappears because there's a lot of cultures that are represented, and within each of those cultures there are different food preferences. So some people actually enjoy eating insects, and that's a staple of their diet. That's not something we would link to a diet in the United States. So cultural influence does have an effect. A great example would be individuals who adhere to kosher religious practices. They do not consume certain meat types, and again, that's totally influenced by culture and religion and how they perceive what life is to be as it relates to food. And then the last influence on likes or dislike is environmental. And I've given you the example of fruit in Alaska. What on earth does Mackenzie mean by fruit in Alaska? Well, fruit doesn't grow very well in Alaska due to their cold climates. And so people in Alaska may have lower preferences or more dislike of certain types of fruits as compared to someone who is living in the Caribbean or tropical area where fruit growth is abundant. So environmentally or regionally, food does vary. It might be that we here in Wyoming don't consume sushi because of where we look geographically, and that flavor of the sushi could change because we have to get that here. After we look at the influences of likes and dislikes, we also have to realize that foods have very different characteristics. That can come in the form of appearance, flavor, and texture. So going through each of those, we realize that we can assess or evaluate food based on its appearance. That's usually the second thing people do when they buy groceries. First is to look at the price, as we've talked about, and second is to look at the appearance. Does that food look appealing? Is it the right color? So for example, milk should be white, cheddar cheese should be yellow, meat should be red, broccoli should be green. It's a very rudimentary analysis, but it does happen in our subconscious when we purchase food at the grocery store. We can also look at food's appearance in terms of shape or condition. So let's say the shape of a muffin should be kind of round at the top and come to a base. If that muffin is very flat, we might perceive it to be of lower quality and therefore not buy it or choose not to eat it. After appearance, we can assess a food for its flavor. This is probably the characteristic that's most important to food, because food we consume, and usually we continue to consume foods based on the flavor. So flavor incorporates two different components. We have taste and aroma. Both of those are what gonna create the overall flavor profile of a food. We can't have flavor with only taste or only aroma. It's the influence of both that affects our perception of flavor. In looking at taste first, we have to realize there are taste buds on our tongue. And like I said, those taste buds interact with the molecules coming from the food. They match up, and then it sends a nerve signal to the brain to say, oh, I'm picking up a sweet taste, okay? So if we look at this diagram, we see that there are 5 different tastes: sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami. You might hear umami referred to as savory. This one is the most recent taste that was discovered. It was discovered in 2002, and it is associated with that kind of meaty, savory taste. And we see that we pick up sweetness of a food at the very top of our tongue. Salty is the rim of our tongue, sour is on both sides, bitter towards the back, and then umami is really everywhere. Okay, so as we chew our food and mix it around with our tongue, those compounds of the food are interacting with our taste buds, sending a signal to our brain and saying, the food you have in your mouth right now is sweet, or the food you have in your mouth is salty. One thing to note is that taste varies with temperature. Usually hotter or colder foods will have a different flavor than that same food set at room temperature. So this is why in the French culture, cheese is served at room temperature to get the maximal flavor. If you want to do a little experiment at home, one would be to cut up a few slices of cheese and put it in a refrigerator, cut up a few more slices and let it sit on the counter until both got to refrigerated and room temperature, and then compare the flavor of each of those samples. And you'll notice that the room temperature cheese probably has a stronger, more intense flavor than the colder cheese. Reminder that again, we're going to get flavor from both the influence of flavor taste and aroma. So aroma is important in that when we put a food up to our nose or our mouth, or we even enter a room that food is being cooked, our nose will pick up what we call volatile compounds or volatile particles. Those are essentially just molecules on the food that are evaporating or turning into the gaseous state, and then that gas is transported through our nose system to be perceived as a certain aroma. So you see here, we can detect aroma from 2 different methods. First is those gases or volatiles will go in through our nose as we are eating or as we are walking through a room, and we see that the olfactory bulb at the top of the nose has many different nerve endings, and that will send a signal to the smell center of our brain. The second way we can perceive smell is by chewing the food, and as we're chewing, those volatiles are turning again into that gaseous compound, and then from where that mouth and the nostril interact before the food is swallowed, those volatiles will go back up to the olfactory bulb and then send a signal to our smell center. So we see that the nerve endings in our nose and on our tongue are important in sending signals of flavor to our brain to perceive what we are actually eating and the profile of that food. Last characteristic of food would be texture. Texture sometimes gets a lot of people. A lot of people choose not to eat a certain food due to textural reasons. One that I can think of on a personal note would be tapioca. I really enjoy the flavor of tapioca, or even cottage cheese is really all about texture. I just won't eat cottage cheese because of that kind of clumpy texture that you get. Other people love cottage cheese, so it is, again, personal preference and what you decide you like based on certain influences. So if we look at the different textures, we have chewiness, graininess, brittleness, firmness, and consistency. And I've given you examples of each. Taffy would be considered chewier than pudding because we have to force that food across our teeth more so than when we eat a spoonful of pudding. Cream, so something you would get from milk, raw milk, or that you would buy in the grocery store, is less grainy than grits. If you've ever gone to the South, grits are very popular, has a very grainy texture. If we compare a cracker to a soft, chewy caramel, the cracker is much more brittle because as soon as you bite down, it breaks into many, many pieces. The caramel would be almost like the Gluteneer's green banana candy that they made. If you were to bite down on this, very soft, it's not going to break between your teeth. If we think about firmness, the best example for me is because I love meat, a tough steak versus a tender steak. The tender steak will be a little bit easier to chew through, sometimes almost melt in your mouth, whereas the tough will take you many different bites to get through all of that meat particle. And then lastly, consistency. This is really thinking about viscosity. If we remember that term, if we can compare gravy types, we can have a very thin gravy versus a thick gravy. Some instances, a thin gravy is acceptable because you're serving food in a bowl, but if that food has to be served on a plate, thicker gravy might be a little bit better. So I will leave you with this question. Do you ever really think about what you're tasting when you eat? When you put something in your mouth and you start to chew, are you consciously thinking, okay, I'm starting to get a little bitter taste that's interacting with the sweet so it's not overwhelming. I'm also detecting some cinnamon essence, but at the same time I'm getting kind of a coffee note. That probably doesn't go through your mind, but there are people who are trained to do that, and we're going to talk about in class how that training process can occur and why we actually evaluate sensory characteristics of food when we start to think about making food or putting food on the shelf to be sold to our consumers. With that, we will see you on Wednesday.